The papers were not served by a tired-looking process server in a wrinkled suit. They were not delivered by certified mail, a cold and impersonal finality. They were served by his wife Clara at her parents' dinner table, with the bone china gleaming under the recessed lighting and the scent of rosemary lamb hanging in the air. She did it with a laugh. It was a sound Liam had once loved, a bright, tinkling cascade that promised joy. Now it was a weapon, sharp and cruel. She slid the slim manila envelope across the polished mahogany of the dining table. It wasn't a gentle slide, it was a flick of the wrist, a gesture of dismissal, as if she were shooing away a fly. The envelope skittered past the silver salt shaker and came to a stop just beside his bread plate. "What's this?" Liam asked, his voice quiet, a stark contrast to the performative glee radiating from the other side of the table. Clara leaned back in her chair, a smile playing on her perfectly glossed lips. Her father, Richard, a man whose body seemed perpetually braced for a hostile takeover, paused with a wine glass halfway to his mouth, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Her mother, Eleanor, offered a look of what might have been pity if it weren't so deeply laced with condescension. "That, my darling Liam," Clara said, drawing out the word darling until it was thin and sharp, "is your ticket to freedom. And mine, of course, mostly mine." Liam didn't move. He looked at the envelope, then at her. He had known, of course, that this was coming. The chill had set into their marriage months, if not years ago. It had been a slow, creeping frost, starting at the edges of their conversations and finally encasing the heart of their home. But he hadn't expected this public execution, this theatrical flourish for an audience of two who had always, from the very beginning, believed he was unworthy of their daughter. "Divorce papers," Clara added, as if he were a particularly slow child. She picked up her own wine glass, the diamond on her finger catching the light and fracturing it into 1,000 tiny, mocking rainbows. "I had them drawn up last week. It's all very straightforward, no fault. We just don't fault each other." She laughed again, a sharper, more brittle sound this time. "You keep your little drawings, and I keep, well, everything else." Richard finally spoke, his voice a low rumble of satisfaction. "It's for the best, Liam. You have to see that. Clara has certain needs, a certain standard of living. You've done your best, I suppose, but a man can't build a skyscraper with popsicle sticks." The insult was so familiar, so worn from overuse, that it had lost its sting. Richard had never respected Liam's profession. To him, an architect who wasn't churning out soulless glass and steel monoliths for faceless corporations was a hobbyist, not a professional. Liam's focus on sustainable design, on integrating structures with their natural environment, was, in Richard's eyes, a quaint and profitless affectation. Liam's gaze drifted from Richard's smug face to Eleanor's carefully neutral one, and finally back to his wife. Clara, who once marveled at his sketches, who had traced the lines of his blueprints with her fingertips and whispered that he was building the future. That woman was gone. In her place was this stranger, this actress playing to her parents, her face a mask of bored triumph. He finally reached for the envelope. His hand was steady. He could feel their eyes on him, watching for a tremor, for a sign of weakness, for the crack in his composure they so desperately craved. He gave them nothing. He picked up the envelope, his thumb brushing against the crisp paper. It felt both weightless and impossibly heavy. "You're laughing," he said, not as an accusation, but as a simple observation. The words hung in the air, suddenly robbing the room of its celebratory oxygen. Clara's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "It's relief, Liam, a release of tension. You should try it sometime." She waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. Just sign them. My lawyer, Marcus Thorne, you'll love him. He's terribly expensive. Says it will be cleaner if you just agree to the terms. There's not much to contest, is there? Your salary barely covers the property taxes on this house." It was true that they lived in her parents' second home, a sprawling Tudor in the most exclusive part of town, a gilded cage Richard had provided to ensure his daughter never had to experience a life outside the bubble of his wealth. Liam didn't open the envelope. He didn't need to see the clinical, brutal language within. He knew what it would say. It would erase him. It would quantify their 5 years together into a list of assets, almost all of which were hers, and liabilities, which would somehow all be his. He folded the envelope once, neatly, and tucked it into the inside pocket of his simple tweed jacket. He looked at the half-eaten plate of lamb in front of him, the perfectly roasted asparagus, the swirl of potato puree. A last supper. "Well," he said, his voice still unnervingly calm, "if you'll excuse me." He pushed his chair back. The sound of its legs scraping against the hardwood floor was deafening in the sudden silence. He stood, placed his napkin on the table, and turned to leave. "That's it?" Clara called after him, her voice laced with a strange mix of disappointment and disbelief. "You're not going to fight? Not going to beg?" Liam paused at the grand archway leading to the foyer. He turned his head slightly, his profile framed by the dark wood. He thought of all the things he could say. He could talk about the nights he'd spent awake, refining designs that the world's most discerning critics would later praise. He could talk about the phone calls from Zurich, Tokyo, and Dubai, the discreet meetings, the contracts signed and sealed in quiet, wood-paneled rooms far from Richard's gaudy world. He could tell her that the popsicle sticks her father so derided were about to support a legacy she couldn't even begin to comprehend. But he said none of it. "No, Clara," he said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of absolute finality. "I'm not." He walked out of the room, leaving the three of them in the opulent, sterile silence, their victory suddenly feeling hollow, incomplete. They had expected a scene, a drama, a satisfying confirmation of their superiority. Liam had denied them that. As the heavy front door clicked shut behind him, a small, cold smile finally touched his own lips. The game they thought they were winning had only just begun, and they had no idea what the real stakes were. It's a tough story to watch unfold, isn't it? The kind of moment that makes your blood boil. If you've ever felt underestimated or unappreciated, then you know exactly what Liam is feeling right now. We've all been there in some way. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you're enjoying this journey and want to see how Liam gets his quiet, dignified revenge, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what happens when he finally decides to show them who he really is. Their beginning had been a whirlwind, a cliché of opposites attracting. Clara was a supernova, all bright light and crackling energy, pulling everyone into her orbit. Liam was like a deep, still lake, his surface calm, belying a world of intricate thought and hidden depths. They met at a gallery opening, a place where Liam felt at home and Clara felt bored. He was there to admire the architectural photography. She was there because her mother insisted it was the place to be seen. He was standing before a stark, black and white print of Louis Kahn's Salk Institute, lost in the interplay of shadow and concrete, when she appeared beside him. "It's just a bunch of buildings," she had said, not with malice, but with genuine, almost childlike bafflement. Liam had turned, and for a moment, he was struck silent. She was more dazzling than any of the art on the walls. "It's more than that," he'd finally managed, his voice softer than he'd intended. "It's a conversation between light and form. It's about creating a space that inspires thought." To his surprise, she didn't walk away. She tilted her head. "Explain it to me." And he did. For the next hour, he walked her through the gallery, not just showing her pictures, but telling her the stories behind them. He spoke of harmony, of human scale, of buildings that breathed with their environment. She listened, her eyes wide, fascinated not so much by the subject, but by the passion with which he spoke. For the first time in her life, someone was explaining a world to her that wasn't centered on stock prices or social calendars. Their courtship was a montage of such moments. He would take her to see half-finished construction sites, pointing out the elegant simplicity of a cantilevered beam. She would drag him to galas and charity balls, dressing him in borrowed tuxedos and laughing as she taught him to waltz. He was her secret project, her intellectual curiosity. She was his vibrant, chaotic muse. The problems began, as they always do, with family. The first time he met Richard and Eleanor was a trial by fire. Richard had shaken his hand with the grudging reluctance of a man forced to handle a distasteful object. "So, you're an architect," Richard had said, his tone making it sound like an affliction. "We use a firm, Stratton and Company. Big buildings, profitable ones. You've probably heard of them." "I have," Liam had replied evenly. "They do excellent work if you like glass boxes." The comment had hung in the air, a tiny spark of rebellion. Richard had glared, but Clara had squeezed his hand, a conspiratorial giggle escaping her lips. In those early days, she saw his quiet defiance as a virtue, a sign of the integrity she found so refreshing. But the constant drip of her parents' disapproval was like water on stone. They chipped away at her perception of him, slowly, methodically. "Is Liam's firm ever going to get a significant commission?" Eleanor would ask, her voice dripping with faux concern. "He's not with a firm, Mom. He works for himself. He prefers smaller, more meaningful projects," Clara would defend, though with less conviction each time. "Meaningful doesn't pay the bills, darling," Richard would counter, swirling a brandy snifter. "A man is supposed to provide, to build an empire, not a birdhouse." Liam heard it all. He was the silent observer at their family dinners, the dead weight at their country club gatherings. He saw the way Clara's defenses of him grew weaker, the way her eyes would slide away from his when her father made a particularly cutting remark about his income or his ambitions. She was slowly being pulled back into her family's orbit, and the gravity of their wealth was a force he couldn't compete with. His own success was a secret he guarded jealously. He had started his own company, Ethelred Designs, with a small inheritance and a singular vision. He avoided the flashy, high-profile competitions. He built his reputation in the shadows, through word of mouth among a clientele so wealthy and so private they considered public recognition to be a vulgarity. His clients weren't corporations. They were vintners in Napa who wanted a home that grew from the soil like their vines. Tech billionaires in Seattle who wanted a sanctuary of wood and glass hidden in a forest. Art collectors in Japan who needed a space that honored both the art and the emptiness around it. He worked from a small, unassuming office downtown, and later from a studio he built in the guest house of their home. Clara never entered it. To her, it was just Liam's shed. Inside, however, were the tools of a master craftsman building an empire Richard couldn't even conceive of. Blueprints for eco-resorts in Costa Rica, detailed models for private museums in Europe, and his journal. The journal was his constant companion, a simple, unadorned volume of worn brown leather filled with sketches, calculations, and thoughts. It was the repository of his soul. In it, he sketched not just buildings, but ideas. On one page, a design for a load-bearing wall. On the next, a sketch of Clara, laughing in the sunlight on their honeymoon, a memory he was trying to preserve before it faded completely. And on a page toward the back, he had once sketched a car, a 1964 Aston Martin DB5 in silver birch. He'd seen one at a classic car show years ago, and its beauty, the perfect marriage of form and function, had captivated him. He showed the sketch to Clara. "Oh, darling, it's beautiful," she'd sighed, tracing the elegant lines with her finger. "That's a dream car, the kind of car someone drives when they've truly made it. When we're rich and famous, you have to buy me that car." He had smiled, a sad, knowing smile. At the time, he had just landed the Napa Winery project, the one that would lay the foundation for his entire fortune. He could have bought her 10 of them, but he realized even then that for her, the car wasn't about the object itself. It was about the display, the proof. He tucked the sketch away and never spoke of it again. The dream was his, not hers. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that if he ever achieved it, he would have to do it alone. The days following the disastrous dinner were a study in quiet efficiency. Liam packed his belongings with a methodical calm that felt alien even to him. He moved through the cavernous house that had never felt like a home, gathering the few items that were truly his. His books on architectural theory, a collection of worn vinyl records, his drafting tools, and the clothes in his closet, which looked meager and out of place next to Clara's sprawling designer wardrobe. She made no effort to help or to hinder. She drifted through the house like a ghost of its future owner, speaking into her phone in hushed, excited tones, planning a life that was already moving on without him. He was an inconvenience, a piece of old furniture to be disposed of. He found a small, furnished apartment in a part of the city she would have described as unfashionable. It was clean, minimalist, with large windows that looked out over a canopy of old oak trees. For the first time in years, Liam felt he could breathe. The weight of Richard's mansion, with its heavy drapes and oppressive silence, was gone. Here there was only light, air, and the quiet hum of his own thoughts. His phone rang 2 days after he moved out. It was Clara. Her voice was impatient, clipped. "Have you signed them yet?" she demanded without preamble. "Good morning to you too, Clara," Liam said, his voice even. He was at a small desk, sketching in his journal, the morning sun warming his hands. "Don't be clever, Liam. It doesn't suit you. I need those papers signed. Marcus, my lawyer, says we can have this all wrapped up in a month if you don't make things difficult." "And why the sudden rush?" he asked, genuinely curious. He could practically hear her eye roll through the phone. "I have plans, Liam. A life to get back to. A trip to Greece is in the works, and I can't be bogged down with this." This was their marriage. 5 years reduced to an administrative hurdle. "I'll have my lawyer look at them," he said. There was a pause. "Your lawyer?" Clara's laugh was a short, sharp bark. "Liam, you can't afford a lawyer. At least, not one that can go up against Marcus Thorne. Just sign the papers. It's the easiest way. I'm even being generous. I'm not asking for alimony." The implication was clear. She believed he would be the one needing it. "Nevertheless," Liam said, "I'll have someone look at them. I'll be in touch." He hung up before she could reply, the calm in his chest solidifying into something harder. Resolve. The next day he was sitting in an office that was the polar opposite of his own modest studio. It was on the 50th floor of the city's most prestigious skyscraper, a building, ironically, designed by Stratton and Company, Richard's favored firm. The office belonged to Evelyn Reed. She wasn't what he expected. She was in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her reputation preceded her. She was known as the sharpest, most feared, and most respected family law attorney in the state. She handled the divorces of billionaires and celebrities, cases where the stakes were empires, not just houses. She read the papers Clara had served him, her expression unreadable. She placed them neatly on her expansive glass desk. "Mrs. Albright, soon to be Miss Vance again, I presume, is either very confident or very foolish," Evelyn said, her voice a low, precise instrument. "This document assumes you are a man of negligible means. Are you a man of negligible means, Mr. Albright?" Liam met her gaze. He had been vetted and recommended to Evelyn by one of his most private clients, a man who valued discretion above all else. He knew he could trust her. "My financial situation is complex," he said carefully. Evelyn leaned forward, a flicker of interest in her eyes. "I love complex. Simple is boring. Simple is for Marcus Thorne, who is, by the way, an overpriced buffoon who relies on bullying and bluster. So, enlighten me. Let's unravel your complexity. For the next 2 hours, Liam talked. He laid out the structure of his business, Aethelred Designs. He explained the network of international holding companies and trusts, all legally and meticulously structured by the best minds in Geneva and New York, designed to protect his assets and his privacy. He didn't work for a firm, he was the firm. He didn't have a salary in the conventional sense. The profits from his projects were funneled into investments that grew with quiet, relentless efficiency. He didn't speak with pride or bravado, but with the simple, factual tone of a man describing the mechanics of a well-made clock. He had built this financial fortress not out of a desire for ostentatious wealth, but as a shield against the world of men like Richard, a world that measured a man's worth by the size of his bank account. He had built it so that he could be free to do the work he loved, on his own terms. When he finished, Evelyn was silent for a long moment. She steepled her fingers, her sharp gaze fixed on him. "Mr. Albright," she said slowly, a slow smile spreading across her face. "This is not a divorce. This is a demolition. And I have to say, I am very much looking forward to it." She picked up the flimsy papers from Clara's lawyer. "Their opening offer is that you walk away with your personal effects and they keep everything else. It's insulting." "I don't want her money, Ms. Reed," Liam said quietly. "I never did. I just want what is mine." "Oh, we'll get you what's yours," Evelyn assured him, her eyes gleaming. "But first, we're going to let them play their little game. We will comply with their requests for disclosure. We will give them every single piece of paper, and we will let them choke on it." She stood and extended a hand. Her grip was firm, confident. "They've mistaken your humility for weakness, Mr. Albright. It's a common and often fatal mistake. Let them think they're winning. The fall will be that much more spectacular." As Liam left her office and stepped into the elevator, he felt a strange sense of calm. He had surrendered control to a capable ally. The burden of his secret was now shared. He looked at his reflection in the polished steel doors of the elevator, a man in a simple jacket, looking no different than he had a week ago. But everything was different. The foundations for the next phase had been laid. Now it was time to let the other side build their house of cards, right before he pulled the table out from under them. The humiliation, as Liam had anticipated, was not a single event, but a campaign. Clara, emboldened by Liam's silence and her father's backing, set about erasing him from her life with a public and performative zeal. The first salvo was the divorce party. Liam heard about it from Sarah, a mutual friend who called him, her voice a mixture of apology and outrage. "I'm so sorry, Liam," she'd said. "I got the invitation. It's awful. It's a gold and black theme. The invitation says, 'Free at last.'" "Is she quoting Martin Luther King Jr.?" Liam asked, a note of dry amusement in his voice. The absurdity was almost comical. "Worse," Sarah replied. "She's quoting a pop song. There's a picture of her on the front, breaking a chain. It's in the most appalling taste." Liam was sitting in his new apartment, a cup of tea growing cold beside him. On the large drafting table that now dominated the small living space, blueprints for a new project were laid out. A cliffside residential complex in Portugal, one that required an innovative approach to structural engineering to combat coastal erosion. He was absorbed in a particularly tricky load-bearing calculation. "Thank you for calling, Sarah," he said, his focus already returning to the elegant lines on the paper. "I appreciate it, but please don't worry about me." "Aren't you furious?" Liam considered the question. Was he furious? Fury felt like a hot, messy emotion. What he felt was colder, more precise. It was the feeling of a strategist watching his opponent make a series of predictable, foolish moves. "I'm busy," he said, which was the truest answer he could give. "Enjoy the party if you go. I hear the catering will be excellent. Richard spares no expense when it comes to appearances. The second front in the campaign was opened by Richard himself. He held court at the Oak Crest Country Club, a place where status was the only currency that mattered. He made sure to speak loudly, his voice carrying across the manicured putting green to where a group of mutual business acquaintances were practicing their swings. "A clean break," Richard announced to a sycophant who was nodding along eagerly. "That's what my Clara is getting, finally shedding the dead weight. A man has to have ambition, you know. You can't soar with the eagles if you're tethered to a turkey." One of the men in the group, a property developer named George, had always had a grudging respect for Liam. He'd seen some of Liam's early, smaller projects and recognized the talent. He excused himself and called Liam later that day. "Your father-in-law is holding a master class in being an ass," George said bluntly. "He's had a lifetime of practice," Liam replied, his tone mild. He was on site at a downtown renovation, overseeing the installation of a custom-milled wooden staircase that spiraled up 3 floors like a strand of DNA. The noise of saws and drills filled the background. "He's telling everyone you're destitute, that Clara is being generous by not suing you for spousal support." "Is that so?" Liam ran his hand along the smooth, curved grain of the handrail. It was a piece of functional art, something Richard would never understand. "And what do you think, George?" There was a pause. "I think Richard Vance is a blowhard who wouldn't know real talent if it hit him in the face with a T-square. But you need to be careful, Liam. Mud sticks, especially in this town." "I appreciate the warning," Liam said, "but I've found that mud washes off. It's the things you build from stone that last." He hung up, the insult sliding off him like water off a well-oiled surface. Each barb, each public slight, only served to reinforce the wall he had built around himself. They were attacking a phantom, a caricature they had created in their own minds. Liam the failure, Liam the charity case, Liam the mild-mannered pushover. They had no idea that the real Liam was miles away, laying the 1,000th brick in a fortress they hadn't even noticed was being built. While they were busy with their parties and their gossip, Liam was busy with his work. He flew to Geneva for a 2-day meeting with the board of a foundation that was commissioning him to design a new alpine research center dedicated to climate science. The project was prestigious, challenging, and most importantly, secret. A non-disclosure agreement thicker than a phone book ensured it would stay that way until the official announcement, long after his personal drama, was resolved. He returned to his apartment to find a sheaf of documents couriered over from Evelyn Reed's office. It was the formal request for financial disclosure from Marcus Thorne. Liam read through the list of demands. They wanted pay stubs for the last 3 years, bank statements, a list of personal assets. It was a standard boilerplate request designed for a standard boilerplate divorce. He sat at his desk and began to assemble the information. Not the simplified version Clara and her father expected, but the full, unvarnished, and terrifyingly complex truth. He printed out the summary statements from the holding company in Delaware. He downloaded the quarterly reports from the investment portfolio in Switzerland. He added the deeds to 3 properties he owned outright: a small vineyard in Argentina, a flat in London's Mayfair district, and a cabin in the wilds of Montana. None of them were in his name directly. They were owned by trusts, which were in turn owned by other trusts, a nesting doll of legal entities that was both perfectly legal and utterly bewildering to the uninitiated. He put it all into a large box. The stack of paper was nearly a foot high. It was a financial labyrinth, and he was handing them the map, confident they were too arrogant to read it. He sealed the box and, with it, sealed their fate. On his way to the courier office, he passed a showroom for high-end automobiles. In the window, gleaming under the spotlights, was a new cherry-red Ferrari. It was flashy, loud, and desperate for attention. It was the kind of car Richard would drive. Liam looked at it for a moment, then walked on. He preferred things with more history, more substance. Things that didn't need to shout to be noticed. His mind drifted to a sketch in an old leather journal, a sketch of a car that was all quiet, elegant power. The time for that was coming. But first, there was the matter of the paperwork. The discovery phase of a divorce is intended to bring clarity. In Liam's case, it brought only confusion and derision from the opposing side. The box of documents Liam had so carefully compiled landed on the desk of Marcus Thorne with a heavy thud. Thorne, a man whose expensive suits were perpetually a size too tight, looked at the mountain of paper with disdain. He called Clara, his voice oozing the smug confidence she paid him so handsomely for. "We've received Mr. Albright's financial disclosure," he said, "and it's just as we expected." "Penniless?" Clara asked. She was at a spa, getting a manicure, a tiny Bluetooth device in her ear. "Worse. He's delusional," Thorne said with a chuckle. "He sent us a mountain of gibberish. Holding companies, offshore accounts, trusts within trusts. It's the classic move of a little man trying to puff up his chest. He's trying to intimidate us, to make it seem like he has some hidden fortune, so we'll offer him a better settlement." "So he has nothing?" "He has a checking account with $3,000 in it, a 10-year-old car, and a fantasy life. He's trying to bury us in paperwork to drive up my fees and force you to settle. It's pathetic. We'll file a motion to compel him to produce a simple, clear statement of his assets. The judge will take one look at this nonsense and laugh him out of court." Clara felt a wave of satisfaction. It was exactly as she'd predicted. Liam, with his quiet ways and his artistic temperament, was trying to play a game he didn't understand. "So what do?" "We do nothing," Thorne advised. "We let him play his little game. It shows the court his character, deceitful, uncooperative. It will only help our case when we argue that he is not entitled to a single penny." Clara hung up, a cruel little smile on her face. She looked at her freshly painted nails, a shade called Crimson Victory. Pathetic. That was the word for Liam. He was a nice man, a gentle soul, but he was weak. And the world, as her father had always taught her, had no place for weak men. She was already moving on. Her new beau, Julian, was everything Liam wasn't. He was the heir to a shipping fortune, handsome in a bland, predictable way, and utterly devoid of any intellectual curiosity. He adored Clara for her beauty and her social connections, and he never challenged her or made her think. Their conversations were a comfortable litany of brand names, resort destinations, and gossip. Richard adored him. "Now that's a young man with a future," Richard had declared after meeting Julian. "His family has a box at Ascot. You see, darling, that's the world you belong in." The days leading up to the preliminary hearing passed in a blur of pleasant distractions for Clara. There were dress fittings for her trip to Greece with Julian, wine tastings with her mother, and strategy sessions with her father about how to best leverage the divorce to paint her as a sympathetic victim of a failed marriage, a narrative that was gaining traction in their social circle. Liam, meanwhile, was living in a different reality, the quiet before the storm. He spent his days in his small apartment, the large windows throwing grids of light across the floor. He worked, he read, he cooked simple meals. He spoke with Evelyn Reed twice, brief, professional conversations. "They've filed a motion to compel," she told him, a note of amusement in her voice. "They're accusing you of willful obfuscation and financial trickery." "And what is our response?" Liam asked. "Our response is to agree. We will be delighted to provide the court with a simplified summary. I'm having a forensic accounting firm, the best in the country, prepare a valuation of Aethelred Designs and its associated assets. The report should be ready the morning of the hearing." "Is that wise?" Liam asked, "to show our entire hand so early?" "Mr. Albright," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "when your opponent is standing on a trapdoor, you don't just hint at the lever. You pull it. You let them fall. Thorne has built his entire case on the assumption that you are a pauper. We are not just going to show him he is wrong. We are going to vaporize his entire argument in one clean shot. Let them walk into that courtroom confident. Pride, as they say, goeth before a fall. The night before the hearing, Liam couldn't sleep. It wasn't anxiety that kept him awake, but a strange, humming energy. He walked over to the drafting table, where the plans for the Portuguese cliffside residence were laid out. He picked up a pencil and began to sketch, losing himself in the familiar comfort of lines and angles. He was designing a life for others, a life of beauty, tranquility, and strength. He had spent years building these sanctuaries for his clients, all while his own home life crumbled around him. He had poured all his passion, all his creativity into his work, leaving little for himself. He looked at the complex, elegant structure taking shape on the paper. It was strong, anchored to the bedrock, yet it seemed to float above the crashing waves below. It was a metaphor for the life he was now building for himself. He had been a secret for too long, a hidden strength. Tomorrow, for the first time, he would step into the light. Not for them, not for Clara or Richard or the gossiping crowds at the country club, but for himself. He deserved to see what his own life looked like, exposed to the sun. He worked until the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows, feeling not tired, but ready. The courtroom was a small, stuffy chamber on the third floor of the county courthouse. It smelled of old paper and stale coffee. Clara, Richard, and Eleanor arrived together, a phalanx of privilege. Clara wore a cream-colored silk dress, an outfit chosen for its air of innocent victimhood. Richard was in a dark, pinstripe suit, his face set in a mask of grim determination. He was there to protect his daughter, his asset, from the grasping hands of the lower classes. They took their seats at one of the polished wooden tables. Marcus Thorne was already there, arranging his files with a practiced, theatrical fussiness. He leaned over and whispered something to Clara, who laughed, a bright, confident sound that echoed unnaturally in the solemn room. Liam arrived a few minutes later, alone. He wore a simple, well-fitting gray suit, a white shirt, and a dark blue tie. He looked not like a defendant or a plaintiff, but like an observer. He took his seat at the opposite table. He nodded a polite greeting to the court stenographer. He did not look at Clara or her family. His calm was a placid lake, and they were on the other side of it, their reflections distorted by their own agitation. Evelyn Reed swept in moments before the judge, a leather briefcase in one hand and an aura of absolute command surrounding her. She gave Liam a brief, reassuring nod and sat beside him, placing her briefcase on the table with a soft, definitive click. "Showtime," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the judge's bench. Judge Miller was a woman in her 60s with a reputation for being sharp, impatient, and utterly immune to theatrics. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and peered down at the two tables. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice crisp, "I have your motion to compel. You allege that the defendant's financial disclosure is intentionally convoluted and designed to mislead the court. Is that correct?" "It is, Your Honor," Thorne said, rising to his feet. "My client, Mrs. Albright, has been more than generous. She seeks only a clean and swift resolution. Mr. Albright, on the other hand, has responded with this." He gestured to a copy of the box of documents on his table. "A deliberate and cynical attempt to obscure the simple fact that he is a man of limited means, likely in an effort to extort a settlement to which he is not entitled." Judge Miller looked over at Liam's table. "Ms. Reed, your response?" Evelyn Reed rose slowly. "Your Honor, my client apologizes for the complexity of his financial situation. He is a private man, and his business is structured to reflect that. However, in the interest of clarity and expediting these proceedings, as Mr. Thorne so desires, we have prepared a summary." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a single, bound document, no more than 20 pages long. It was simple, elegant, and professional. "This is a valuation of my client's primary asset, his design firm, Aethelred Designs, and its associated holdings. It was prepared by Deloitte, and the methodology is detailed in Appendix B. We can, of course, provide the court with the thousands of pages of supporting documentation, but I believe this summary will suffice. She walked forward and handed one copy to the clerk for the judge, and then walked over to the opposing table. She didn't hand the document to Thorne. She placed it directly in front of Richard. She knew her audience. Thorne was a lawyer, but Richard was a businessman. He understood numbers. She returned to her seat. A hush fell over the courtroom as the judge began to read. Thorne looked at the document with a dismissive sneer, but Richard, his curiosity picked it up. He flipped past the title page. His eyes scanned the first few paragraphs. Then they stopped. He blinked. He reread the sentence. His confident posture began to sag, almost imperceptibly at first. His face, moments ago flushed with righteous indignation, began to pale. Clara, noticing the change in her father, leaned over. "What is it?" she whispered. Richard didn't answer. He just stared at the page, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the document. His eyes darted from the paper to Liam, a look of pure, unadulterated disbelief on his face. On the page was a single summary number, the net asset value of Aethelred Designs. It was a number with 9 digits before the decimal point. Thorne, oblivious, was still posturing. "Your Honor, I'm sure whatever summary Miss Reed has concocted is just more of the same fantasy." "Mr. Thorne, be quiet," the judge snapped, not taking her eyes off the report. She looked up, over the top of her glasses, her gaze landing on Liam. It was a long, appraising look. Then she looked at Clara's financial disclosure, which listed her assets as a trust fund and a collection of designer handbags. The disparity was so immense, so staggering, it was almost comical. The quiet bomb had detonated. The silence it left behind was deafening. Clara, growing frantic, snatched the report from her father's hands. She scanned the page, her eyes searching for the source of his shock. She wasn't a businesswoman. The complex charts and financial jargon meant nothing to her. But she knew how to read numbers. She saw the final valuation at the bottom of the page. "What is this?" she said, her voice a thin, reedy whisper that was shockingly loud in the silent room. "This is a joke, right?" She looked at Liam, her eyes wide with confusion and a dawning horror. She was looking for the man she thought she knew, the gentle, unsuccessful artist she had decided to discard. But the man sitting at the other table was a stranger. His calm was no longer the meekness of a sheep, but the patient stillness of a wolf. Liam met her gaze. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. His expression was one of profound, weary sadness. This was the moment he had both dreaded and meticulously planned for. The moment the curtain was pulled back, revealing the truth he had hidden for so long, not out of shame, but for his own peace. A peace that was now shattered. Judge Miller closed the report and placed it on her bench. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dangerously soft, "given this new information, your motion to compel is dismissed. Furthermore, I suggest you and your client take a brief recess to reevaluate your position. This court will reconvene in 30 minutes. She banged the gavel, the sharp crack echoing the sound of Clara's world breaking apart. The moment the judge left the bench, chaos erupted at the Vance Albright table. Richard grabbed the report back from Clara, his face a mottled canvas of red and white. He shoved it in front of Marcus Thorne's face. "Did you see this? Did you have any idea?" he hissed, his voice a furious whisper that was more menacing than any shout. Thorne, his face slack with shock, stared at the numbers as if they were written in a foreign language he had never seen before. This can't be right," he stammered, his professional bluster completely gone, replaced by the panicked look of a man who has just realized he has brought a knife to a gunfight. "It's a bluff. It must be." "A bluff?" Richard's voice rose, cracking the courtroom decorum. "Deloitte doesn't bluff. They're a multi-billion-dollar accounting firm. They don't risk their reputation on a bluff for a divorce hearing. He rounded on Clara, his eyes blazing with a fury she had never seen directed at her. What did you do? You lived with him for 5 years. How could you not know? I... I don't know, Clara cried, her voice rising in panic. The carefully constructed facade of the serene victim was shattering. He just drew pictures in his little shed. He wore tweed jackets. He drove a 10-year-old Subaru. People with 9-figure net worths don't do that. Her words hung in the air, a testament to the shallow, materialistic world she inhabited. She had judged Liam by the cover, and it had never occurred to her to read the book. She looked across the room at Liam. He and Evelyn Reed were standing, quietly conferring, completely ignoring the meltdown happening at the other table. They were calm, in control. They had been in control the entire time. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't a lucky break for him. This was a plan. His quiet departure from the house, his calm acceptance of the divorce papers, his refusal to fight or beg. It hadn't been weakness, it had been strategy. He had been playing a different game all along, a game of chess while she was playing checkers, and he was now announcing checkmate. Richard, regaining a sliver of his predatory business instincts, smoothed his tie and started to walk towards Liam's table. The rage had been replaced by a sickeningly smooth veneer of conciliation. "Liam, son," he began, his voice oozing a false warmth that turned Liam's stomach. "Perhaps we've all been a bit hasty. There's been a clear misunderstanding." Evelyn Reed stepped smoothly between Richard and Liam, a polite but immovable barrier. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice chilled steel, "if you wish to speak to my client, you may do so through his attorney. And right now, my client has nothing to say to you." Richard faltered, his practiced charm useless against Evelyn's icy professionalism. He looked past her to Liam, his eyes pleading. "Liam, we're family." Liam finally looked at him, his gaze level and unyielding. "No, Richard," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "We are not. You made that perfectly clear for the last 5 years." He turned and, with Evelyn at his side, walked out of the courtroom, leaving Richard standing alone in the middle of the room, his hand outstretched to no one. Clara watched him go, a storm of emotions warring within her, rage at his deception, humiliation at her own blindness, and a terrifying, nascent flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, respect. And with it a wave of regret so powerful it almost buckled her knees. The man she had discarded as worthless was, it turned out, worth more than her entire family. Later that day the phone calls began. The first was from Thorne, his voice frantic, suggesting they immediately offer Liam a generous settlement to make this go away. The second was from her father, barking orders, telling her to fix it. "Do whatever you have to do," he'd commanded. "Apologize, beg, I don't care. We cannot afford to have this man as an enemy." The third call she made herself, to Liam's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then went to voicemail. His voice, calm and measured, filled her ear. "You've reached Liam Albright. Please leave a message." She opened her mouth to speak, to scream, to cry, to apologize, but no words came out. What could she possibly say? She hung up, the silence in her opulent bedroom more deafening than any accusation. She was alone, truly alone, adrift in the wreckage of a life she had so carelessly torpedoed. She had gotten her freedom, just as she'd wanted, but it felt for the first time like a prison. The date for the final settlement hearing was set for a month later. In that time, the world reoriented itself around the new reality. Marcus Thorne, on behalf of Clara, sent a flurry of settlement offers, each one more desperate and generous than the last. They offered him the house, which was technically Richard's, a lump sum of 7 figures, anything to avoid a formal, public accounting of assets. Evelyn Reed rejected them all with polite, single-sentence letters. My client will see you in court, they all concluded. The story of Liam's hidden fortune, though not public, began to leak through the rarefied social circles of the city. Whispers at the country club turned from mockery of Liam to bewildered speculation. Richard Vance, a man who prided himself on his ability to judge other men, had made a catastrophic miscalculation, and it was costing him his most valuable asset, his reputation. He became withdrawn and irritable, his bluster gone, replaced by a quiet, simmering panic. Clara, stripped of her father's unshakable confidence and her lawyer's arrogance, began to unravel. Her trip to Greece with Julian was postponed. Julian, who could smell a social disaster a mile away, suddenly became very busy with a family matter in Monaco. Her friends, the same ones who had attended her divorce party, now spoke to her in hushed, pitying tones. She was no longer the triumphant divorcee, but a figure of tragedy and ridicule. The woman who threw away a winning lottery ticket because she didn't bother to scratch it. Liam, for his part, remained insulated from the drama. He continued his work, his life falling into a new, peaceful rhythm. He finalized the designs for the Portuguese project and began preliminary sketches for the Alpine Research Center. His quiet apartment became his sanctuary, a place of creation and focus. He did only one thing that was out of the ordinary. One Tuesday afternoon, he took a taxi to an industrial park on the outskirts of the city. He stopped in front of a nondescript building with no sign on the door. He entered a code, and a heavy steel door slid open. Inside was a climate-controlled garage, a sterile white space that housed a single, shrouded form. Liam walked over and pulled back the silk sheet. There it was, a 1964 Aston Martin DB5, its silver birch paint glowing under the cool LED lights. It was perfect, not a replica, but an original, painstakingly restored over 3 years by the best artisans in England. It was the car from his sketch, the car from Clara's long-forgotten fantasy. He had purchased it 5 years ago, shortly after their honeymoon. The commission from the Napa Winery project had been his first truly massive success, the one that proved the viability of his business model. He had wanted to celebrate, to buy something that was just for him, a tangible symbol of his secret success. He had never told Clara. He knew, instinctively, that she would see it not as a work of art or a personal milestone, but as a commodity to be flaunted. And so it had remained his secret, a promise he had made to himself, kept hidden from a world that wouldn't understand. He ran a hand along its cool, curved flank. The car was not a weapon, it was a statement. It represented everything he had built in silence: craftsmanship, elegance, power under restraint, and a deep appreciation for things that last. The morning of the final hearing dawned bright and clear. Liam woke early. He did not put on the sober gray suit of the preliminary hearing. He chose a bespoke navy blue suit from a tailor on Savile Row, a crisp white shirt, and shoes polished to a mirror shine. He looked not like a man going to court, but a man attending the opening of a symphony. He did not call a taxi, he drove himself. The Aston Martin's engine turned over with a low, throaty growl, a sound of refined power. He navigated the city streets with ease, the car handling like an extension of his own body. He felt a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place. He had timed his arrival perfectly. As he turned onto the street in front of the courthouse, he saw them. Clara, Richard, and Eleanor, huddled on the grand stone steps, a miserable tableau of a family in crisis. Richard was gesturing wildly, his face red. Clara was weeping, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, her expensive dress looking rumpled and forlorn. Liam didn't speed up or slow down. He maintained a steady, deliberate pace. He pulled the Aston Martin into a reserved space right in front of the courthouse steps, a space Evelyn Reed's office had quietly arranged for. The car glided to a perfect stop. The argument on the steps died instantly. The three of them froze, their mouths slightly agape. They stared at the impossible vehicle that had materialized before them. It was so beautiful, so iconic, it seemed to have driven out of a film. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the driver's side door opened. A single, impeccably polished leather shoe was placed on the pavement. Then another. Liam unfolded himself from the driver's seat. He stood, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. The morning sun glinted off the car's silver paint, off the chrome of its wire-spoke wheels, and off the quiet confidence in his eyes. He looked, in that moment, like a king arriving to survey his kingdom. The silence on the steps was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of city traffic. Clara stared, her weeping forgotten. Her face was a mask of utter, gut-wrenching disbelief. It was the dream car from the sketch, from that long-ago conversation when their life together had still seemed full of promise. It was real, and he was driving it. The sight of it was more devastating than any legal document, more cutting than any angry word. The nine-figure valuation had been an abstract concept, a number on a page she couldn't fully comprehend. But this was a dream made real. A dream she had once shared and then discarded. A future she had thrown away. Liam didn't look at them. He acted as if they weren't even there. He walked to the front of the car, his gaze fixed on the courthouse entrance. A valet, young and crisp in a red jacket, suddenly appeared at his side. He had been hired for the occasion, instructed to be waiting at this exact time. Liam reached into his pocket and produced the keys, the classic metal stamped with the elegant Aston Martin wings. He didn't toss them. He placed them gently into the valet's outstretched hand. "Take good care of her," Liam said, his voice calm and low. "Of course, Mr. Albright," the valet replied. It was only then, after the transaction was complete, that Liam's gaze finally swept over the trio on the steps. He didn't sneer. He didn't smile. His expression was one of cool, dispassionate assessment. He looked at Richard's apoplectic face, at Eleanor's horrified one, and finally at Clara. Her face was a battleground of emotions. The shock was giving way to a dawning, horrific understanding. It wasn't just about the money. It was about this quiet, unshakable competence, this ability to make dreams manifest. This was the man she had called a failure. This was the man she had laughed at. The gulf between her perception and his reality was a chasm so vast, she knew in that instant she could never cross it. The life she could have had, the man he could have been for her, was driving away in a silver dream, leaving her stranded on the cold stone steps of her own ruin. Liam held her gaze for a single, charged second. Then he turned and walked up the steps, his posture perfect, his stride unhurried. He walked past them as if they were statues, relics of a past he had already forgotten. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse swung open for him and then closed, shutting them out. Inside, the proceedings were a mere formality, an epilogue to a story that had already ended. The courtroom was the same, but the atmosphere was entirely different. The energy had shifted, the poles of power irrevocably reversed. Clara, Richard, and Thorne sat huddled at their table, looking defeated before the first word was spoken. Clara's makeup was smudged, her expensive dress now seeming like a costume for a part she could no longer play. Liam and Evelyn sat in quiet composure. Evelyn had a single, slim file in front of her. Liam had nothing. He needed no notes. Judge Miller entered and took her seat, her gaze lingering for a moment on Clara's disheveled state before moving on. "We are here," she began, "to finalize the dissolution of the marriage between Clara Vance and Liam Albright. Ms. Reed, your client has rejected all settlement offers. What are your terms?" Evelyn stood. "Your Honor, my client's position has been consistent from the beginning. He is not a vindictive man. He seeks no part of Ms. Vance's personal assets or the trust fund established by her father. The assets of Aethelred Designs and all its subsidiary holdings were established by my client prior to the marriage or from proceeds derived from premarital assets. They are, by law and by right, his and his alone. She paused, letting the silence in the room amplify her next words. Given the significant disparity in the parties' financial positions, any claim for alimony or support from Miss Vance would be, frankly, frivolous. Therefore, my client asked for only one thing in this dissolution. A flicker of hope sparked in Clara's eyes. Was he going to be merciful? Was this his way of ending it cleanly, of letting her escape the utter humiliation? "And what is that, Ms. Reed?" the judge asked. "My client wishes for the return of a personal item, currently in Miss Vance's possession, a brown, leather-bound journal." The request was so small, so anticlimactic, that it took everyone by surprise. Clara frowned in confusion. A journal? She had no memory of any journal. Thorne leaned over, whispering furiously. "What is she talking about? Is there some secret in this journal? Coded account numbers?" "I don't know," Clara hissed back, frantically searching her memory. "He was always scribbling in some notebook. I think I packed it in a box with his other office junk." Judge Miller looked at Liam. "Mr. Albright, is this correct? All you are asking for is a notebook?" Liam spoke for the first time, his voice filling the quiet room. "Yes, Your Honor. It has sentimental value." The judge turned to Clara. "Miss Vance, do you have this item?" I might," she stammered. "It would be in storage, with his other things." Evelyn Reed was already on her feet. "Your Honor, we had a subpoena issued for the item in question. The bailiff has retrieved the box from Miss Vance's storage unit." At a nod from the judge, a bailiff entered carrying a dusty cardboard box labeled "Liam's Office Crap" in Clara's looping handwriting. He placed it on the table in front of Liam. Liam opened the box. Inside were old textbooks, broken pencils, and rolls of outdated blueprints. He reached in and pulled out the journal. It was just as he remembered, the leather worn smooth at the edges, the spine softened with use. He held it in his hands, the weight of it familiar and comforting. He opened it to a page near the back. On it was the original sketch of the Aston Martin. On the facing page were a series of complex equations and a rough initial design for the Napa winery, the project that had been the genesis of his entire fortune. The ink was faded, the paper slightly yellowed. It was the birth certificate of his empire. He closed the journal and placed it in his briefcase. He looked up and met Clara's confused, questioning gaze. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of a debt settled, a chapter closed. This journal was his story, and she was no longer in it. Evelyn Reed stood one last time. "With the return of his property, Your Honor, my client considers this matter concluded." The final gavel fell. It was over. Liam stood, shook Evelyn's hand, and walked out of the courtroom without a backward glance. He left behind the wreckage, a weeping ex-wife, a ruined father-in-law, and a lawyer who was already calculating how to sue them for his unpaid fees. He didn't feel triumph, only a profound and welcome sense of peace. He had gotten back the only thing he had ever truly wanted, himself. 6 months later, the city skyline glittered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. It was a view Liam knew intimately because he had designed the building that provided it. He sat on the wide, minimalist balcony, a new leather-bound journal open on his lap, a charcoal pencil in his hand. He wasn't sketching a building, but the pattern of light and shadow on the leaves of a Japanese maple in a pot beside him. The air was cool, the silence broken only by the distant, muted symphony of the city. His life had found its new equilibrium. The divorce was a fading memory, a strange and dramatic prelude to this current chapter of quiet contentment. The fallout on Clara's side had been swift and brutal, as he knew it would be. He had followed the news, not out of schadenfreude, but with the detached curiosity of an architect observing a controlled demolition. Richard, in a desperate attempt to claw back his social and financial standing, had made a series of high-risk, reckless investments. They had failed spectacularly, wiping out a significant portion of the Vance family fortune. The grand Tudor house where Liam had been served his freedom papers was on the market. Clara's life had imploded. Julian, her fair-weather beau, had vanished permanently. Her social circle, smelling failure, had ostracized her. She had been forced to sell her car, her jewelry, and to move into a modest apartment her trust fund could barely support. She had, in essence, been forced to live the life she had always feared, the life she had once accused Liam of consigning her to. She had tried to reach out. A series of letters had arrived at his new office, a sleek glass and wood space he had also designed. The envelopes were addressed in her familiar, looping script. The first was angry and accusatory. The second was pleading and remorseful. The third was simply sad. Liam had instructed his assistant to file them away, unopened. There was nothing she could say that would change the past, and he was no longer interested in it. His focus was on the future he was building. He had not become cruel or vindictive. He had, in fact, instructed Evelyn to ensure the final settlement was not punitive. Clara was left with her trust fund intact, enough to live comfortably, if not lavishly. He had not sought to destroy her, only to extricate himself from her. His revenge was not in her downfall, but in his own quiet, soaring success. He thought back to that day in court, the Aston Martin gleaming in the sun. He had sold the car a month later. It had served its purpose. It was a beautiful object, but he was not a man who defined himself by objects. He had donated the proceeds to a scholarship fund for promising young architecture students from underprivileged backgrounds. He was more interested in building futures than collecting possessions. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. It was a message from Sarah, the friend who had called him about the divorce party. The message was a link to a social media profile. It was Clara's. Her bio, which once read, "Globetrotter, bon vivant, lover of life," now said something simpler: interior design student. Her feed was no longer filled with pictures of parties and exotic locations, but with photos of fabric swatches, color palettes, and sketches of room layouts. They were amateurish but earnest. For the first time in a long time, Liam felt a flicker of something for her. Not love, not pity, but a distant, detached hope. Perhaps, stripped of her father's money and her unearned status, she was finally learning to build something of her own. Perhaps she was discovering the simple, profound joy of creating something where nothing existed before. It was the only real source of wealth he had ever known. He closed his journal, the day's work done. He stood and looked out at the city he had helped to shape, a city of stone and steel and glass, but also of dreams. His dream had not been to be rich or powerful. It had been to be free. Free to create, to build, to live a life of integrity and purpose. He looked at the skyline, at the soaring lines of his latest building catching the last rays of the setting sun. He had faced humiliation and had not broken. He had been given immense power and had not become a monster. He had sought not revenge, but resolution. And in the end, he had found it. He had built his own sanctuary, not of concrete and steel, but of peace and self-respect. And it was a beautiful place to live. What a journey, right? It just goes to show you that true worth isn't about what you have, but about who you are. It's not about the car you drive or the house you live in, but the integrity you live with. Liam's story is a powerful reminder that patience, dignity, and a belief in your own value are the most powerful assets you can have. What do you think? Was Liam right to hide his success for so long? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, and you believe in the power of quiet strength triumphing over loud arrogance, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this. You never know when you might need a reminder that the best revenge is living a life beyond your detractors' wildest imaginations.